Hi and welcome everyone to the Bromley area. For those of you not familiar with this location, I'll point out a few features. So in front of us is the Bromley residential red zone, and the sweeping coastline that you can see there is the walkway that we'll be heading down to shortly, and on the right hand side of the mud flats that we'll look at. Straight ahead off in the distance is the New Brighton Pier, and beyond that the Pacific Ocean. So let's swing around to the left and we'll look out across the city. So off in the distance are the Southern Alps. In that direction is the centre of town, and then we've got the Bromley wastewater treatment plant and wastewater treatment ponds. Then there's the Port Hills, so looking about south at the moment. And then southeast we've got the estuary, and back to our little area of the estuary, which is connected by under Bridge Street that you can see to the right there. So let's head down and have a look. So down in the Bromley subdivision itself, so this was full of houses, so all the little trees dotted around in odd locations were around houses. So during the earthquakes there was a lot of damage to the houses in this area, and many were uneconomic to repair. There was a lot of liquefaction, and also as a result of all those processes there was quite a lot of ground subsidence, so the whole area here sunk down a fairly significant amount, over half a metre in many places. There's a little bit of work going on the track at the moment, so that's what the digger and so on's for. There's been a little bit of damage to the track, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So the track you can see here is also serving as a stop bank, so it's acting as a barrier to keep the water out of the subdivision area, former subdivision area. So let's head on up and we can have a look at the mud flats in a bit more detail. So quite often with mud flats we sort of have a look at them and go, that looks a bit uninviting. I've spent a bit of time walking around them, so they can be quite sludgy, quite smelly, but actually they're places with an awful lot of life. So we'll zoom in and have a bit of a look around at some of the life in this area. So it's fairly obvious on the surface that we've got lots of birds running around, nuzzling their way down into the dirt. So they're looking for all sorts of different types of goodies to eat. So snails, shellfish, crabs. There are various fish in there as well, of all sorts of different types. Invertebrates, all sorts of things. So what we're looking at is actually a fairly complicated ecosystem, and as soon as you start thinking about ecosystems and potential development, then you've got to think about how sensitive the receptors in that ecosystem might be to any pollutants that might be going in. So your assignment is considering tapping into some resources in the subsurface, so we'll be thinking about that more as we go. But basically receptors are different animals or creatures, or even plants potentially, in an ecosystem that may be impacted by whatever is being moved around as a process of development. So we'll head on around a little bit further down the walkway and see what other things we can see a little bit further on. Okay, the walkway does continue a little bit further down that way, but pretty much it's just a dividing area between, on the left hand side we've got the Avon River. So in a normal sense the Avon River would flow from our left to our right, but at the moment we've got the tide just starting to come in, so you see the water's actually moving a little bit upstream at the moment. More elements of the ecosystem that we can see. You can see a lot more of the vegetation from this perspective, and the vegetation here has to be fairly well adapted. It's a difficult situation for a range of different plants, so they have to be fairly specially adapted to be able to cope with the freshwater and saltwater brackish environment. So of course plants are another big part of the ecosystem as well. They're home to lots of invertebrates, which birds tend to feed on quite a bit. They produce berries and all those kind of things, which can also become part of the whole food web. And then back on the right hand side again is the mudflats we were just walking around. So now we're going to head off down the track a little bit, have another look at the red zone area and see what else we can see. Okay, so there's a bit more information about the estuary area and some of the wildlife there. It's not a full set of the types of birds that you would find out there, but some of the particularly interesting ones. Another little sign just there, we'll see that on the way back. Let's go and have a little bit more of a think about this hypothetical development, trying to dig up the area and extract some resources. So it's a very common thing around the world for people to want to make use of resources. So this area that used to be a subdivision hypothetically might have some useful resources under it, and a group is interested in getting into that, and they see the economic value of that possibility. So when we're thinking about environmental assessment reports, we want to think about all sorts of different values. We want to think about receptors, we want to think about risks. So there's a whole lot of different ways that we can look at things. Just a little bit of a side point there. We've got, we're in the red zone, but there's still a house hanging on. There's still one or two houses dotted around the red zone of people who decided not to leave. From a risk perspective, if we just have a little pause and look at this location at the moment, compare the level of the ground on the left hand side of the stop bank versus the water level on the right hand side, and keep in mind that this is actually at low tide with low flow, so the water can get significantly higher than that. So that's just a little thing to keep in the back of your mind. So let's think a little bit more about what other values might come into play. We've talked about the potential value, economic value of the resources, but we've also talked about ecosystems, and they have inherent value, so there's an ecological value to be considered in this area. And then also we've got a nice walkway that we've just come along, so there's actually some slightly less tangible types of values. There's the aesthetic value, how cool the place is, how it makes you feel, so there's actually a well-being value to the location. And then also really importantly, thinking back into the history of the area, obviously a really rich potential food gathering location, so there's lots of aspects of kaitiakitanga, so guardianship, that the local Maori people would have had and still hold, that are very useful to consider in a hypothetical situation like this. So that's a little bit of thought about values. There's probably some other things you can come up with there. Another thing that we do want to think about is transport, which seems like a bit of an odd thing to be thinking about. But so far we've just sort of considered this potential extraction site being adjacent to this ecological site. But there are possibilities of transport as well that we need to think about. And we'll just have a little bit of a look at this sign, see what that's about. So again, clear indication that people hold some pretty strong values about the ecology in the area and wanting to protect that. So back to the whole transport side of things, there may be a number of things obvious as far as transport goes, and some things may be slightly less obvious, especially considering how things are now versus how they might be in a construction or extraction type situation. This little area that we're walking past now, while not particularly active at the moment, used to be a nice freshwater spring. We'll have a look at the old info site shortly. And one of the things that we found as a result of the earthquake sequence was a lot of the subsurface hydrology changed significantly, so some freshwater spring sites became less active, others popped up out of nowhere. But if we think about what a freshwater spring is, that's water coming from the subsurface up at a different location than where it entered. So that's a potential mode of transport. So that would be one of the many things that would need to be considered for an extraction type situation. So if you've got groundwater moving underneath, that can take potential contaminants from one location, which may not seem too bad, potentially to another location where there are a lot more sensitive receptors, which could cause more issues. So what other types of transport could there be in a situation like this? Well, we've got aeolian transport. So if anyone's lived near a new building site, then quite often you get movement around of dust off sites like that, so that can be very difficult and frustrating, and if there were contaminants associated with that dust, then that's more of an issue. And from an aesthetic point of view, I couldn't help but stop here for a moment and have a bit of a look at this lovely plant. So I mentioned berries before, so flowers, berries, all those kind of things. If you think about what interacts with those, so you've got insects interacting with flowers, you've got birds eating berries and then flying off to other locations. Again, if there was potential for contamination, then that's being moved to a different location. So what are those transport vectors? Where do they go to? What other environments could potentially be impacted. But here we are back to our vibrant hub of life, the mudflat. Let's head off and have a look at one more thing before we finish up. So at the moment, as I said, the tide is just starting to come in, so the face of this area can change quite a bit. So we'll have a little look at that in a minute, and hopefully this has given you plenty to think about for your assignment, and also thoughts as a developing environmental scientist as well. So all best for the assignment.